every day. Time no day, so every day. If you see what happened today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of my podcast series, Home Notes. This is my very first episode with a guest, and she is none other than Amanda Iheme. Hello, Amanda. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you. Do you know the funny thing? I've stumbled
Me.
over the past 2 years on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
I've stumbled on you or some of your projects or initiatives just randomly. And every time I just stop to like read, like, oh, what's she up to? What's she up to? And I'm always so like, this is so interesting. This is so cool. So I'm actually happy that I get to talk to you today because I just like secretly and
Yeah.
silently following you for 2 years. But
Me
just so
too.
that, yes, thank you. So just so that I know, and for the people who would watch, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your practice?
Okay, so my name is Amanda Iheme. I am an artist, a professional architectural photographer, and I'm now expanding my artistic career to also include education. So I'm teaching now. I'm currently teaching a class at Miliki for the next 2 months. We end in March. I'm teaching artists about artistic research and how to make that a part of their artistic practice so they have much more robust and richer bodies of work.
Yeah.
Um, and then I'm also a clinical psychologist as well. So I have a mental health practice that I've been running for the past 8 years, and I'm the
Mhm.
clinical director of the practice. So these are the two things that I do. I also have a newsletter and a podcast of my own, which in the middle of doing therapy and photography, there has
Yeah.
been literally no time to like really write or record any notes or episodes at all. But yeah, these are the two major things I do. I practice psychology and then I also practice photography and I teach as well. Yeah.
That's amazing. I'm just like, can you see
Good.
multidisciplinary in the way?
Honestly, real scenario, not even joking. For
uh, Honestly, everywhere. But I love that. Like, I feel like it's so holistic and like well-rounded too. When you think of creative, sometimes you don't really think.
yeah.
I, I think you're the first clinical psychologist that I am meeting who also has a creative practice and like those things. Or an artist person has that. Like, do you get like? I feel like it's a
Yes, I
holistic
do.
approach.
Yeah,
Um.
when people meet me, they typically ask like, "How did you blend both things?" Like one is
Yeah.
in science, the other is in art. So how do they mix? But I just tell them that on both sides, the one thing that connects all of them is like it's a study of human behavior. So in psychology, I'm more in depth into how the mind works, but with architecture photography, it's more about how different factors in human life eventually affect how we build and how the way we build also impacts us as human beings. So, as much as my work in photography is geared towards preservation, it's also preservation that acknowledges the value of our architectural heritage and its impact on us as individuals. So, in everything I do, the one thing that connects it is that there is an interaction with human beings, either
Yeah.
directly or indirectly.
That's amazing. And that's actually true. Very true. And speaking of architecture, we come to
Yeah.
um I stumbled on the way of life. And it's very interesting to me because I was at home in Lagos late last year,
Hmm.
and you would drive through Nikon, you drive through Marina, you drive through and you see these buildings and you're like, what's going on? Like what's going on there? I want to know more about that.
Yes.
And like, I've just been very interested in those conversations to restore those buildings because I think
Hmm.
they speak to like those diasporic connections, so like even colonial
Yes.
history in a way that
Hmm.
we can study in depth. So when I stumbled on the way of life, I was like, this is what I want to talk to her about. So can you tell me a bit about how you got into like why this project? How did you get into it?
So initially, it wasn't even supposed to be what it turned out to be. So the can I remember the process? So I wanted to document historical buildings in
Yeah,
Lagos. Actually, that's not the beginning. So let me start from the beginning of the story.
please.
I had finished my NYSC,
Yeah.
so not NYSC, I had finished working as an intern in Nigerian breweries. I'd finished my master's degree in Swansea, wanted to get a PhD, didn't get it. Came
Mhm.
back to Nigeria and then started working. I had started photography at the time and I wasn't even sure what type of photography I wanted to do. I was dabbling in different things. So after 2015 came along and I was working at Nigerian breweries and they were like, oh yeah, your internship is over now. So pack your bags and get the fuck out. So I packed my bags and I left and I was home, no prospects, no jobs on horizon, nothing at all was waiting for me. So I spoke to a friend of mine and I was like, hey, do you know anything I can do? I have a camera. I can work as a photojournalist, me just trying to explore something. So she said yes, she works at a magazine and they'll be interested in working with me. So I came into the company and told them I can work as a photojournalist and we started looking for a story to work on. So the first story I worked on was documenting the shrine, which is next to the office, the
Mm.
Elegushi Shrine,
Okay.
which is very messy and scary. And after we after we did that project, everyone was just like, "Yeah, let's not carry jazz. Delete, delete, delete." Everyone was like, "Delete those images immediately." So I deleted them, and then we were sitting together, and the owner of the company I was working at the time ran this Twitter page called it's like a historical page. I can't remember the name at the moment. So we were looking through some images of like historical Nigeria, and I was telling him like, I like history. We can find a story around here, see what is
Mm.
possible. Then we found Ilojoba, and then
Mm.
he goes like, "Oh, okay, you guys should go there and find out what's up in that building. What's the story
Wow.
of that building?" So we went to Ilojo Bar and we had a conversation with the person who was living in the bar at the time, which is Paolai, which is documented in the body of work. And he started telling us about like Afro-Brazilian history and all of these stories. I'm just like, whoa, whoa, whoa. There's like this whole thing that's going on in Lagos that I didn't even know about. There's like a
Yeah.
whole community of people, like so much like information. And I was like, this is very interesting. I want to know more about this Afro-Brazilian history. So I took pictures of the house in 2015 and he connected us to the Afro-Brazilian community head, someone who took
Yeah.
us on a tour around Lagos Island to tell us about the different families, the path that had followed when the slaves had come back to Nigeria and
Mm.
gotten land from Lagos State. So he was telling us about the history, and I was going to go more in depth into that story. That's when one of the jobs I had interviewed for, they were like, "Green, green, girl, come start work." So this was like November, December of 2015
Yeah.
and it was at Stanbic. So I left. I remember I was at this holy cathedral in Lagos Island, very close to
Hmm.
is it Holy Cross Cathedral? I can't remember, but there's a cathedral that's close to Freedom Park. So I was there and I was just like I said this little prayer to the Guru and I was like, this story that I've started, I don't know where it's gonna take me and I don't know what's going to happen with it, but I leave it completely in your hands. So I
Mm.
left and that was the last day I ever touched that project. Then in 2016, I had worked at the bank. Um, I had then discovered my interest in art. I had started like an art page where I was talking to people about where to go for shows, galleries, profiling some Nigerian artists because I felt that Nigerian artists were not getting as much visibility as they deserved, like
Mm.
photographers, graphic designers, and the rest. So I was at Stanbic and I just told my boss, like, I want to leave. I want to go into arts. I'm interested in that. Then I moved to
Yeah.
Alara. But when I was working Alara, I was working as the PA to the head of Alara. But if you know Alara, Alara is art in itself. So it was just
Yeah.
like a very beautiful connection. I was like, okay, I'll work here as a PA and then I'll get into art one way or another. So one day in November 2016, I remember that me and Mrs. F were sitting together having a conversation about um, a product that she wanted to release into the market for Alara. And then I opened up, was it Bella Ninja or something? But I just saw a news front page and they were like, they've torn down Ilojoba. I was like, what the fuck is going on? It was such a heartbreaking moment. Like, I was
Yeah.
so speechless. I was incredibly speechless. And I didn't even know how much it affected me until later on.
Mm.
So, as time went on, I kept on thinking about the building. From that moment to 2016 up until 2019, I couldn't go to that area of Lagos Island because anytime I try to go there, it's just when you've lost something, you kind of like try to avoid being
Yeah.
there, like not to trigger
Yeah.
any like grief and stuff like that. And I
Yeah.
I, I didn't understand it because I was like, how is it possible that I have created an emotional attachment to a building? So it was very heartbreaking for me. And by 2017, I was unhappy with my life, I was unhappy with my job, and I wanted to try something new. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to leave and start my own practice and then take my photography seriously.
Mhm.
So when I left, I started NDD, which is my mental health practice, and then I started my photography. I started to speak to different architects and stuff because at the time I had now figured out that I wanted to document buildings because it
Mhm.
was my area of interest. So I spoke to a few people. They were like, "You had to train yourself a bit more." I went for some classes at African Arts Foundation,
Yeah.
and then the director at the time, Charlotte, she reached out to me and she says, I like your images and we have Lagos photo coming up in 2018 and I'd like to feature your work. So I said, okay, sure. She was like, okay, so what do you have so far? Then I showed her these pictures of Ilojoba I had taken and also some pictures I had taken over the couple of years of like different buildings in Lagos, both historical, colonial, and those that were not colonial. And she
Mhm.
said, okay, fine, create a body of work for me and then we'll see where it goes. I've never created a body of work before. So I had this big elaborate dream. Oh my goodness. It was gonna be a combination of photography, um 3D no, it was photography, animation, written work and that, where I was just going to tell people the story of the pretty much like the development of Lagos State, but
Yeah.
using buildings as the touch point. And I had sat down with this friend of mine who was doing animation at the time. We had started talking about the story, but as time went on, it kept on becoming bigger and bigger and bigger than me. And time was going because an exhibition was coming up. So I
Yeah.
went back to meet Charlotte, and Charlotte was like, girl, you're doing too much. Like, relax, cut it down, sit down, shrink it, figure out what your touch point is.
Yeah.
So one day I went home and I remember sitting in front of my desk and I was like, God, like, what is the story? Because I know what it's like to photograph places from a place of fun and excitement and joy. But now that I'm doing this body of work, it doesn't feel as fun as it used to be before. And that the motivation for wanting to even tell this story was the fact that they had torn down Ilojo Bar. And
Yeah.
I wanted to find a way to preserve all the other ones. So I was like, okay, if the story was preservation, then there's a whole new story here. Like
Mhm.
you're thinking about preservation, you're thinking about grief, and you want people to understand the importance and the value of buildings. And you know that the way people are going to um the best way to get people to understand certain things is to create empathy and
Yeah.
for them to feel what you have felt. So for me, getting them to feel what I had felt, getting them to feel what I had felt was letting them understand that human beings and buildings were not very different from each other.
Mm.
Like they're not different at all. We have the same experiences. We're all born, we go through different changes, and then we die. So I sat on my desk and I was like, holy shit, this is a whole new story. Like, if you go on my website, there's pages of my written work to sort of guide you through my thought process, the
Yeah.
conceptualization of the work. So in that one diary entry moment, I entered the whole thing and I looked at it and I was just like, wow, I'd been chasing a different story. Meanwhile, there was another story to be told.
Yeah.
So after looking at the story that had come up to me, which was that human beings go through different parts and human and buildings do the same thing as well, I then went back to my archives to start looking at photos I had documented in the past, like 2015, 2016, 2017, and realized like unknowingly I had actually been taking pictures of places that actually
Yeah.
symbolize different types of change in the cycle of life. So that was how the way of life was born. So it wasn't a straightforward path. It
Mhm.
was something that was supposed to be something but ended up being something else
I
that
see.
is much more. I think that the impacts that that project has had was most likely greater than what the one I had designed would have been. Well, I don't
Mm.
even know if it would have because that project never came to life. But I think that
But
just looking at the impact that that work has had is like, yeah, this it couldn't have gone any other way. So that's pretty
yeah,
much it. So yeah, we are. We have the work.
it's so and it's so special because I think growing up in Lagos too, I took a lot of these things for granted. You just drive through and you're like, oh, okay, that one is there. But like seeing you being able to go back and
Yeah.
really say, let's question, let's what's happening over here. Like, to take your time and take us to and what you
Yeah.
say about the empathy, like we're looking through your website and how you document everything. I feel that because I'm just like, okay, now I have more questions. But I want to know what was the most peculiar thing that you found? and why? In just looking through, going to those buildings and maybe documenting.
Peculiar. Um, I think the one thing that stood out for me is that as Nigerians, and let me just be specific and say Lagosians, when it comes to,
Okay.
don't know, now that I don't live in Lagos, Lagosians and the mindset of other Nigerians, those similar in some way, try as much as possible to be specific about a location and not generalize and say Nigeria when I just mean
Mm.
Lagos. So what I've noticed in Lagos is that when it comes to the preservation of the architectural heritage here, it's almost non-existent
Mm.
because Lagos is very capitalist focused. They're thinking about how to make money, how to be a metro city, how to just they just want to keep making money. And for them, it's like let's wipe away what was to now build what is without recognizing
Yeah.
that there is knowledge and
Yeah.
wisdom in what was and that you can actually just adjust it to fit what is. It's very sad. So some of the buildings that I've documented have been torn down. Some of them have
Mm.
been changed over time, and the changes that have occurred were not even anything to write home about. They were not, it's not like they
Yeah.
remodeled them to something much more impressive or something better.
Yeah.
No. They just changed them into something they thought was contemporary. But just because it's contemporary does not mean that it's good. So I've
Mm-hmm.
learned that architectural heritage does not matter as much to Lagosians. And even the
Mm.
preservation of important information. Because when I was photographing at the what's it called? The place that I used to signify stagnation, um,
The old secretariat.
Ministry of
Yeah.
Justice, yes, secretariats. I was seeing like files of, case files that were written confidential, private, and they were just littered on the floor
Lying there.
like no man's
Yeah.
business. There was this doc just lying there for anybody to access. There was one about a prostitution that happened between the Imo State governor at the time. Funds had been used wrongly that were meant for development for the people, but then it had been put into his
Yeah.
political, what's it called? His political campaign. And so I was just like,
Yeah.
this is confidential information that you are supposed to be
Mm-hmm.
preserving that is just out here on the floor for anybody and their father to just access. I learned that architectural heritage matters much when it comes to the fate of money. The
Mm.
preservation of confidential
Mm-hmm.
information is out the window. If it is in the past, it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter. Is what is
Mm.
going on right now. So that was I wouldn't call it peculiar. I think it's more of a validation of um how things operate in the larger scheme of things. Like when you think about
Yeah.
Lagos and how things move here, you just realize like once you're in the past, you're in the past. Nobody's looking for you, no one's checking for you. Everyone's just thinking about how to move forward. And the thing that motivates them to move forward is how much money can I make from this? So I think that was one of
Mm.
the things that stuck out for me. Yeah. So because of that, I realized that people would destroy anything, even if it has so much value. The moment they realize that there is money to be made, they will destroy it. They don't care
Mm.
what is that. And they will much rather destroy something and build something that doesn't work, like all these awful buildings we have now, as opposed to spending money to maintain something that works and modify it into something that can be better.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's the problem, and that is
that's
crazy.
it.
And
It
it's
is
true that you can tell a lot about what a city values by buildings, because that's one of like the most. It's very obvious. It's right there in your face.
visible.
But before
Yep.
I go back,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I just want to go back to that old secretariat, because even when I saw stagnation, I'm like, this is a very, I'm going to ask about this too. I know you just talked a bit about the confidential information you saw lying on the floor, but I want to know if there was anything else that felt
Yeah.
stagnant. Like, walk me through your own process of walking into the building and just
Mhm.
photographing.
If you ever get a chance, because now the secretariat is you have a bit of to it because you can security guard or talk to someone that works there and they'll give you access. But if you ever enter the building, it's a building that is frozen in time.
Mm.
It's a massive building. It's huge with so many of windows and seal them shut. The doors, they've locked them up. And if you walk through some corridors, you genuinely feel like you are in colonial era because it looks so
Mm,
colonial. It looks so British. Like the style of the architecture, the corridors, even the bricks as well. Some of them have the stamp of like I think the British crest or the royal crest on it, because the bricks that were used
mm,
to build them were imported from the UK. So you can still see some of the stamps or some of the bricks of the wall. Style of the building is almost as touched it after they moved the seat of power from Lagos to Abuja. So it's a building that is frozen in time. There are some offices that are still being used because Ministry of Justice, so they have some of them are actively being used, but they're not that many. It's just one
mm,
section of the building. So imagine a building that has like 68 rooms and they only just use 10.
mm,
That's what it's like. So when I went into that building, I was like, it feels like nothing has ever changed here. Nothing
mm,
has been done here. Nothing has moved here. Um, some parts of the walls were broken down and you could also see like the red bricks of on the walls and such
mhm,
like that. So I was like, man, this building has not this area of this building has not been touched for so many years. So that experience of the stagnation of the development of that building or the growth of the building was what inspired the term stagnation. Because it's stagnant.
mm.
They've not done anything to it. Yeah.
It's so crazy. It's like you're living in the past, but you're not acknowledging. It's a weird kind of, is it amnesia? What would we call it? Living in the past, but you're not acknowledging. It's like it's just there. You're not really engaging it in a way that is
Mhm.
supposed to make you like better the city or better the is it's crazy the
Yep.
disconnect and you're staying in the exact same place. Okay,
Yeah.
I get the
Yep.
picture. That's crazy.
Yep. Yep.
And just I'm trying
It
to
is indeed. It is.
you found like stamps, photographs, what else did you find? I'm
Yeah.
curious because I know the other you said most of the offices are kind of
Um.
locked and there's some you can go through.
Yeah. Yeah. So I found files. I remember seeing the documents about some guy who had forged 20 naira notes and he was being arraigned to court. I found the document about the Nigerian versus Sam Mbakwe. I found old passport photographs. I found train tickets, both transport tickets for places in Benin. I remember it was
Mm,
Egedengbe. That was the name. I can't remember where. But I found train tickets, I found boat tickets, I found
mhm,
stamps, I found tapes, cassette tapes, that had records of people's information. Um, yeah,
mhm,
I think I can only remember the things I picked up, or those are things like most of the things I found were in that category. So people's information, people's passport, legal documents, tickets for
mhm,
transportation, tickets for things, cassette tapes that people hadn't touched, broken down furnitures, locked cabinets, furniture piled upon furniture, lots of cobwebs, a lot of cobwebs everywhere, dust,
yeah.
what else? Broken parts of the wall because they had broken down parts of the building. So red brick all over the floor. What else was there? I think, as far as I remember, those were major things that I found in.
Wow. Wow. Okay. And the way I'm just the way as you say something, I'm just like imagine myself walking through and just seeing all these different things that you're talking about as well. But this is honestly, it is a very the visual representation is in fact I feel like sometimes I like to I would write and I'm like, okay, this is how I'm going to be able to explain what I feel is going on. But the picture is very clear. Like just that is very clear. But I just wanted to this is a big question, but I wanted to ask it anyway. In your opinion, how do you think we can
Mhm.
like champion accessibility to these sites? Because it's like best kept secrets, but they are visible. But it's like it
Yeah,
still feels like a secret.
yeah,
But beyond what we see on
yeah,
Google, because there's not much. Like how do we
yeah.
champion accessibility to this site? And two, what other sources did you have to go to find documentation? I guess this secretariat, the Ministry of Justice one is like it's there, it's clear, all the files are there, so it's like
Yeah,
an archive on its own. But I'm just curious to in other buildings that you
yeah,
photographed, what other sources do you have to go to?
yeah. So some of the information for the other buildings were based on interviews. So speaking to people
Oh,
who live there, work there, like there's one of the buildings, I'm trying to remember, the Cuban Lodge. So the Cuban Lodge was a
yeah.
mix of interviews with the Afro-Brazilian community and research that was done online that people had documented. So there's a
Mhm.
lot of reading. Then one of my major reference points was the PhD thesis of, it was a thesis by an architect called Longue. I'm trying to remember her first name. I
Mhm.
have the document somewhere here in my folder because I keep my research materials. So her research was very, very helpful because it really chronicled like a lot of Afro-Brazilian buildings. It was a case for the conservation or a case for the preservation of architectural heritage.
Mhm.
And so she had like a vast amount of information
Mm.
about these buildings, about
Yeah.
their history. For some of them, she even had their blueprint. So
Hmm.
how the
Okay.
buildings were designed. And she didn't just focus on contemporary and she didn't focus on Afro-Brazilian alone. She also looked at traditional Yoruba architecture as well. So
Mm.
it was a wealth of information that I got from her thesis. So finding material was online research, interviews that were conducted with people who lived in some of these buildings. Like after the Cuban Lodge, I got information about that from, it was a blend of interviews with the Afro Brazilian community members and
Yeah.
then research that I found online. Some of
Mm.
them I had to get information from watching videos on YouTube.
Mhm.
Some of them were chapters from books. Some of them were research articles that people had written both in Nigeria and in Brazil. So I
Yeah.
had to also like look at some work of Brazilians who were looking into historical architecture in Lagos, trying to
Mhm.
connect their roots and make sense of
Yeah.
their reality. So it was a blend of different resources to be able to find information. I was referred to even go to the National Museum to get more information about Ilojuba, but there was just no time for me to be
Mm.
able to do this. So I
Yeah.
just made do with what I had to be able to find what I put on my website.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Good. That's a nice picture. Thanks. So I'm always on the hunt for now where I say, let me just say public archives in
Mm-hmm.
Lagos or in Nigeria. So I ask everybody now. That's when they meet and I'm like, where did you get that from? What, where did you go? But it's a mix. Thanks for sharing
Yeah,
that.
you're
But now
welcome.
to your process of photographing. I know you
Mm-hmm.
have photographs of new builds, but for the old buildings, did you ever go
Mm-hmm.
back to them? Like after taking them maybe a year or so, I don't know how many months or years might have passed, but like
Yeah.
if you go back to them, did you notice any changes?
For some of them, yes. For some of them, no. So for Ilojoba, it was destroyed. I went back. I photographed Ilojoba the first time in 2015. By 2016, she was destroyed. I went back there for a photograph of what I call the graveyard, and it was 2019.
Mm.
For Cuban Lodge, I pass by Cuban Lodge often because I live in Lagos. So when you're in Obalende, Lagos Island area, you pass by. The only
Yeah.
thing that has changed so far is just the painting of the building because it's now a kindergarten. So not
Mm.
much has really changed. For Secretariat is still pretty much the same. I haven't gone inside, but people typically use it for music videos, for fashion shoots.
Yeah.
So I get to see like glimpses of like how they reutilize the space. And I just pass by it every time I'm in Lagos Island and I'm going from CMS to PI.
Yeah.
For Jekyll House, I used to live in Ebutemeta, and Ebutemeta was very close to the railway. So when I go on walks, I'll always go past Jekyll House. It still looks the same. It's very well maintained. The
Mm.
garden is perfectly well manicured. People go there now for picnics. You can go rent like a mat and just like have a good time in the outdoor area at Jekyll House.
Mhm.
For should I building did I even document again? I'm trying to remember. There's one more. One second. Let me open up the work itself. Glover Hall. Yes, Glover Hall has been completely remodeled. They did like a whole revamp of it. I hate it. The revamp, I think, is ugly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like it. Some of the spaces that the interior, especially, there were spaces that were just beautiful as they were,
Yeah.
that they changed and made smaller. It was
Mm.
no, it's just not working. So I did photograph the construction of the new Glover Hall. And I know they
Yeah.
had good intentions, but when you're not working with someone who understands historical preservation of buildings, what they will create for you is their own contemporary idea of what that
Mhm.
should look like. And I
Yeah.
don't think they did a really good job of that. So yeah, so it's a bit disappointing, but at least the building still stands and I still have my images of what it used to look like before, so I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
Um Lagos State Water Corporation, LASWA. LASWA and I, we have a long-term relationship. I've been documenting her since her construction phase in 2017. And she's a Falomo, so I'm always passing by and seeing her almost every 2 business days. So she's all right. She's got W Bar. People go there. It's one of the best bars in Lagos. The lights are
Mhm.
always shining. The boats is there. So I haven't photographed her this year. So I'm going to go photograph her this year. So my plan is to photograph her once every year and then see how she
Yeah.
changes over a trajectory of like 10 years.
Mhm.
Then there is Waterhouse. Waterhouse is a family house. And the matriarch of the house, as at today, she's still alive.
Mm.
And so the house still stands. The exterior still looks the way it does. It's still good, it's strong. I don't know about the interior, but the exterior still stands strong. So those are the buildings. Some of them have died, some of them have changed, and some of them are still the way they were. Some of them have been repurposed into or even expanded in terms of allowing access for public to engage with them.
Yeah.
So yeah,
That's cool.
yeah.
And I guess going back to the two words that are also on your website, reincarnation and renewal, what does it look like?
Mhm.
What do you think it looks like for these buildings to undergo some kind of reincarnation or renewal?
For reincarnation with Glover Hall, it the story was really a reincarnation story, which is like something coming back because the building that exists now for Glover Hall is not the original Glover Hall,
Yeah.
but they rebuilt Glover Hall again. So it was like the building came back. So that's why it's actually Glover Memorial Hall, not
Yeah.
Glover Hall itself. So for me, reincarnation is really if something goes away, then bringing it back in its exact form or in something else that memorializes the way it was before.
Mhm.
And I don't see a lot of reincarnation happening with Nigerian buildings, especially here in Lagos. I just see them getting torn down and
Mhm.
then they build these ugly apartment buildings there. So there really isn't a restoration or reincarnation pattern in
Mhm.
today's building style.
Yeah.
Rather, I just see like just like an annihilation, like just death and then the birth of something new,
Mm.
something completely new that aligns with the time. What I'd
Yeah.
have loved to see more is a lot of restoration of old buildings, like they did with Jekyll House, seeing these buildings as architectural heritage, and rather than tearing them down, either because of family disputes or because they want to make more money of it, but recognizing the worth that the buildings have as they are, and
Mhm.
then capitalizing on that by remodeling them or restoring them and maybe turning it into a tourist site, a place where people can engage with the history
Yeah.
that the building signifies, or even allowing people to continue to utilize the buildings. Like when you go to places like in Europe, you'd see that a lot of their old buildings are still kept as they are. But what happens is that they are just redefined in their usage. So they
Yeah.
don't tear down the
Mhm.
building, they just restore it and then redefine its purpose. So that's what I would have hoped to see, but that's not what's happening because what is restoration to a Lagosian? If not a
Mm.
waste of money, when he can build a 15-floor apartment and make 50 million naira from that. What's his business with architectural heritage? All things are gone away. So not a lot of renewal, not a lot of restoration, not a lot of reincarnation, just death and creation. That's what I just see. A cycle of death and creation.
Mm. Wow.
Yeah.
And that picture that has been going on for many, many, many years. So I'm glad for this episode. I'm glad for stuff for that. It's a legacy 1995. Is that what
Yes.
they're trying to
Yes.
do? I'm just hoping that in the coming years that becomes something that is at the front of people's minds, both the
I hope
museum
so.
people and also the government, the state
I hope
government,
so.
because yeah. Um but Amanda, thank you so much for your time and
You're
just
very
for
welcome.
sharing. all of this. Like, this is so helpful. This is so good. For the viewers, you can follow Amanda's work on Instagram. I'm going to put her Instagram name in the description box, but it's literally just Amanda Iheme. And
Yep.
stay tuned for more episodes. Stay tuned for more episodes. Yeah, everyone. Bye for
Thank you
now.
so much for having me. Bye.
Bye.
Them no say we day, we come night and day. Sister pave the way, so I no hesitate. Brother tell me say, make I no come exclaim. Cause this gist it day, yes this gist it day.